And so, ladies and gentlemen, I hope that you would welcome our first presenter, Devin Hess.
Good morning, or Zhao Sheng Hao, is that right? I've learned. So I am Devin Hess. I'm with the UC Berkeley History Social Science Project. And just a little background for those of you who don't know the project. We grew out of the single subject matter project that was launched by the California Writers Project. Have people heard of the California Writers Project? It was very popular, very successful, and the state of California, the California Department of Education, decided to fund other single subject projects. So there's a math project, there's a science project, there's a world language project, and we are the History Social Science Project. We're located at UC Berkeley. We're housed there, but we are not of the university. We are of the teaching profession. So all of us come from teaching backgrounds. We believe in our main strength and our main source of inspiration is the teachers themselves. We think ourselves as the conduit from the brilliance of a room full of teachers to other rooms full of teachers. There's 100 people in the room, 5-10 years average experience. We've got like 500,000 years of experience in this room. That's what makes these things work, and that's our role. So we develop the kind of things we develop and explore through teacher research groups, through working with teachers at the district level, through institutes, coming in places like this, and we always learn from the teachers that we work with. Today, one of the goals, and I think Clay said it really well, that it's about the students. And that the goal of the Institute is to, I think he said, help you bring what we share here back to your students. And that process is about pedagogy, because as teachers, we know that you can't just walk into an institution like this, hear some very interesting, academically oriented, adult-level conversations, and then suddenly present that to your students. You can't do that. We have to be the conduit and the source by which we transfer and translate and scaffold that understanding so our students can make sense of it. So when we think about our lesson plans that we develop, we have these various components that make that up. First of all, one thing, the History Project and the new California History Framework, people are aware of the new frameworks, came out about 2 years ago, yes? Well, our project was very involved in writing that, a lot because of our experience, and one of the keystones of that framework is this idea that our teaching of history needs to shift toward an inquiry model and not a content delivery model. We don't need access to content in the way we used to. When I was a student, if I didn't know something historically, I would have to go to the library, go look it up in the card catalog, go to the 5th level of the stacks, find which book is it, find the page, then find that piece of information I wanted, right? And now we can do it in 0.0005 seconds and get 35,000 hits from Google. So our problem isn't content. Our problem is knowing what to do with that content and how to understand and how to ask questions about that content, how to know the stuff that makes sense from the stuff that doesn't, the evidence that's valid from the evidence that's not, and then how to take that and apply a lens of thinking onto that. And that's where we get into this historical thinking. I have to expand that box a little bit. So historical thinking is what Clay was saying. It's like, what do we do with the knowledge? How do we make sense of the knowledge? How do we make sense of the past? And I'll be talking about that a little bit more. But connected with that is this idea of literacy, that education any study of history, social studies is very intermeshed with literacy, being able to understand and make accessible the content or the text or the materials that you're bringing to your students. And I say that because as you know, academic language is fundamentally different from other types of language. It's certainly different from conversational language, right? Where you can point to things, you can get feedback immediately. You have this sort of it's completely different vocabulary level. So you have this challenge of academic language. Not only is it just that it's tier 3 kind of vocabulary that is discipline-specific vocabulary, but you're also getting to this place where, especially if you're looking at primary sources, where the language can be extremely archaic, The construction can be very odd and unfamiliar. And it also has this level of density that is unmatched certainly in fiction writing. When kids, like in elementary school, often their history exposure is reading narratives, reading stories, or reading biographies, and that narrative is sort of follows the kind of arc of a story. When you read into academic texts, you're reading something that has a level of density that is extremely complex. You get into things of nominalization. It's a linguistic concept of, you might have a whole paragraph or a whole section of a chapter talking about the rebellions in China during this period, and then the next part starts out, this uprising, blah, blah, blah. Well, one word has now represented an entire concept. And if you don't make that connection, you've lost your understanding, you've lost the flow. So the density and the complexity of academic language is quite a challenge to our students. So we absolutely believe that you need to be bringing that literacy into it. And which is why, as we do the work with teachers, we work a lot with English language learners, and in some ways some of the same techniques and skills apply to the world language teachers that are in the room here, that it's really not a separate process. Just the other thing about that is that this, as we get into language, and we think about language, and we think about historical thinking, we have this language development occurs best, and there's research that backs this up. Language development occurs best when it's contextualized, right? And when you're thinking about history or something about events in the world, the more it can be contextualized, the more that we can integrate it into a schema that makes sense for us. And so the words just don't become random lists of vocabulary words to memorize, but it becomes part of a conceptual framework we're developing, and therefore it's a deeper learning. And like I say, there's research that develops this, and to me it brings out this idea of the mutual interdependence between the study of literacy and language and the study of historical thinking and analysis, that the two cannot be separated from each other. So as I say that, I know we're talking about historical thinking, and there are a lot of world language teachers in the room. Don't feel like it's a time to check out, right? It's really the time to say, oh wow, here's this contextualization that I can enliven and enrichen my conversations in the classroom as I bring these new ideas to them. And so what are these ideas about historical thinking? The framework talks about elevating historical thinking up to the level of content acquisition, but the framework in history social science framework doesn't define what that is. But we have adopted, at Berkeley at least, have adopted this framework, this model of historical thinking that was developed by Peter Seixas and the Historical Thinking Project in Canada. And what they did, and we're going to talk more about this in the afternoon session, we're going to go a little more deeply into each of these, but what he did and that group did is they basically said, okay, if you're trying to understand history and make sense of history, there are 6 big ideas, 6 big concepts, the big 6, that help us make sense of that world, of the past world and our present world. First one is historical significance. So there's all these events of the past, right? But which of those events matter? Which ones actually bring about change? Which ones have significance, have impact in the world, impact in the direction of history? There's a lot of stuff that's completely irrelevant and a lot of things that are significant. But what is significant depends on who's telling the story. So there's nuances and complexity there. Of course, the evidence that was mentioned, that's how we understand the past. We dig up these pottery shards, and we understand now a whole civilization from this one little picture on one little piece of pottery. And we do these things that try to make sense of the world through evidence. Continuity and change is one that is a big theme in this conference, is how does that flow of history, that ebb and flow of history, how do we make sense of it? And it's more than just a timeline. A lot of times history is based on the changes, this happened, then this happened, then this happened, then this happened, there was a revolution, there was this. But sometimes the continuity is more revealing. Sometimes the continuity of power relations, of class relations, of gender of power relations, sometimes those things don't change, and in some ways it can be more revealing than the sequence of changes that happen. So if you're not looking at continuity along with change, you're missing half the picture. cause and consequence is usually the kind of bread and butter that the history teachers work in, like what are the 5 causes of World War I? Let's memorize our list and be able to regurgitate it on our test. But it's much more nuanced than that, and we're going to talk about sort of it's a web. It's a very complex web of events that impact, and then that the outcomes of which often are even unpredictable. And then we get into perspective about how do we understand the past. Clay was talking about, okay, here we are in the United States, and he's a historian of China, but same thing about, and there's a big gap there in terms of personal life experience, but there's also a huge gap between us and the 17th or 15th or 2nd century. And how do we bridge that gap? What is our current worldview sitting here in this building, in this state? How does that influence how we look at that past? Also, as we look at the past and look at different actors in the past, how do their different world experiences influence what they say about what their experience has been and what the evidence they leave behind? How does that influence that? And because, I think that Clay said this thing's very important. History is not what happened about in the past. It's what we say about what happened in the past. And so the perspective it is absolutely critical and important in being able to even decipher, well, where's that person coming from as they're giving their interpretation of what happened in the past? How does their perspective influence it? So we have this sense, this incredibly important aspect of perspective. And then the last one is my favorite one, is the ethical dimension. It's the so what of learning history. Like, why do we bother? And, there are some history teachers who just love the story, and they love telling the story, and it's like they're up there and there's sage on the stage, and, and it can be totally fascinating, and stories are great. We spend our childhood learning stories. But history is more than that. History is about understanding the past as it can inform who we are, what our responsibilities are. And that includes responsibilities to redress problems and injustices of the past, just as much as it's about our responsibility to be informed actors on the current stage in which we are performing and acting in and living in, because we can be agents in history. So these are the different sort of big 6 concepts we'll be exploring a little bit more later. So we talked about inquiry, and we have this guiding question: how have the lives of Chinese people been affected by the country's rapid modernization since the 1979? So this is an inquiry question, and then we say to ourselves, okay, what are we looking for? What kind of historical thinking does this inquiry question evoke? Does it require? Well, there's sort of the first one that jumps out to me is, well, how have they changed? Well, what was it like before, and what was it like afterward? The continuity and change piece, right? How is it different? So, and that might be the first way you'd read this question, but there's a second way to read this question, which is the cause and consequence. How have they changed? How have the lives changed? In other words, like, what mechanism brought about those changes, right? It's not just enough to say, well, it was like this and now it's like that, but, well, okay, well, so then let's explain how that came to be. And so that same question can be looked at through the lens of cause and consequence in the same way. So these are the challenges these are the lenses, the kind of what we want to take through this day, through this conference. And one of the reasons I was asked to introduce it is I'm encouraging you to basically take these ideas with you as you listen to the presentations. So as you're hearing the speakers talk, we're thinking about, we want to take this back to our kids, remember? This is our goal. So where are we hearing the ideas of continuity and change? Where are we hearing the turning points, the critical moments in history? Where are we hearing progress and decline, and who for whom, right? Progress and decline is often, like, there's a textbook called American Progress. Well, not for everybody, right? So where are we looking for those things? Let's listen for that. And this idea about this complex web of cause and consequence, let's listen for that too. Let's avoid the simplistic this, then this, then this, right? This linear kind of causal train. But let's look for that complexity there. And part of that complexity is, well, so what of this was about the context, and what about it this was the actors who made something happen inside of a context, and who could not have made that happen had the context been different. So how do we tease those pieces out? And intended consequences, like people move into actions, they take actions with a result in mind, but it doesn't always work that way. And so the unintended consequences. So these are some of the historical thinking lenses, the modes of thinking that we want to take with us, because when we get into the afternoon session, we're going to be talking about ways to make these thinking modes explicit, how to scaffold them explicitly. They're not just things we hold onto as we do our teaching and our lesson development, but they're things like any other skill that we are going to scaffold explicitly. So let's do that as we go through the day. I am absolutely delighted to be here. I don't know how to say thank you in Chinese, but if I could, I would say, how do you say it? Huh? Jiao da.
No, I was asking the
Oh.
teachers to teach you.
Teach me, jiao da. Xie? Xie xie? Okay, that'll do it. Thank you. We'll see you later this afternoon.